folk horror. It's a genre of horror all about the past, either taking place literally in the past or dealing with things coming out of it. Its common themes include witchcraft, paganism, ghosts, devils, and vampires of folklore. While many of these themes can also be found in gothic horror, there they exist among castles and aristocrats. But I believe folk horror is a genre for the peasant living a rural existence. Folk horror looks at old religions and superstitions and ponders their truth. Welcome to the Cobwebs channel, my friends, and today we are looking at my top 20 folk horror films of all time. I am so excited to be bringing you this list. I've been working on it for a long time. This is a passion project for me. Of course, this top 20 only has movies that I've personally seen. There's still so much folk horror left to explore, but from what I've seen, this is my favorite and the movies that I think best represent exactly what this genre is. So at number 20, we're starting with Eyes of Fire from 1983. So this movie takes place in 1750 on the American frontier, and there an adulterous preacher is ejected from a small British colony with his motley crew of followers. They make their way downriver to establish a new settlement of their own beyond the frontier, but there discover the land holds curses they were not prepared for. So I own this movie in this box set that Severin Films put out. It's called All the Haunts Be Ours, a compendium of folk horror. Amazing box of tons of different folk horror films. And, you know, this is a genre that can be defined very broadly or very specifically, depending on the person. But Eyes of Fire is the very typical idea of exactly what folk horror is. I feel like when people imagine this genre, I mean, they're imagining people in colonial America out in the wilderness trying to build life from scratch, but encountering horrors of the past. That's exactly what this movie is. And I love the ideas and themes that are in this movie. In the film, they talk about how when innocent blood is spilled, the blood sinks into the earth and collects in particular spots. This area of the new world where they're settling is just such a spot, and there's this creepy tree that marks it as such, the home of the devil. And the movie itself, well, it looks like it might be more of a prestige horror film. It's absolutely crazy. There is this hideous, monstrous witch that they encounter out in the woods. The people that she has killed now exist as spirits on this land, and they appear as these naked mud people, and there's just a lot of wild stuff that happens in this film. There's even a character who gets designated as an Irish fairy. This is absolutely typical folk horror. It's crazy, and I think it's a lot of fun. At number 19, Kwaidan from 1964. So this film is based on a book from the early 1900s called Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things. And the film itself is an anthology that adapts 4 different Japanese folk tales. And this is a movie that I actually just saw for the first time. I really wanted to include some kind of Asian folklore in addition to the many American and European movies that we're going to be talking about today. In fact, the film is so committed to adapting old folk tales, one of the stories is actually introduced by the narrator as not having an ending because many of the stories from ancient Japan were written down without endings. So they're really, really committing to the bit here. Now, as far as each story, how much I love them, it was uneven for me. I like the first story, which is about a man who abandoned his wife to leave a life of poverty, but ends up wanting to go back to her. These are all ghost stories. Kwaidan is an archaic Japanese word meaning ghost story, and that one has a good human hook to it that I enjoyed. The second story is really where it's at for me. It's called The Woman in the Snow, about a man who encounters just that, a very creepy, supernatural seeming woman out in the snow, and she says, if you ever tell anyone that you ever saw me, I will kill you. This story in particular was actually later turned into the final story in Tales from the Dark Side, which is one of my favorite horror anthologies. So it's cool to see its original form, and it is such a creepy, atmospheric, but again, like kind of emotional story that I thought was amazing. The third story I didn't like so much, involving ghosts from an ancient battle. And then the last one is the one that doesn't have an ending. So I did find it a little bit uneven and I didn't completely love it. But what works in the movie really works. What doesn't, which I think a lot of it comes from the fact that it's 3 hours long and I don't think it should be. It's a little too slow for its own good. But I still think it's pretty essential folk horror, and it's good to get a different part of the world incorporated here. At number 18, Midsommar from from 2019. So this film follows a doomed relationship where they are trying to stay together, and they end up traveling with some friends to a remote colony in Sweden, and there they might just discover that they're a super creepy cult. So this is now one of the most famous folk horror films. I mean, definitely one of the most popular. And when it first came out in 2018, I saw it in theaters. I absolutely loved it. I did like it a little bit less this time revisiting it, which is why it ended up a little bit lower on the list. Now, writer-director Ari Aster said that he made this movie right after going through a horrible breakup. And I think that's why the thing about the movie that resonates the most is the central relationship. Now, the two people that this movie centers on, their relationship is awful. Like, it is painful to watch from the beginning. A lot of people just kind of simplify it, I think, by just saying, oh, Christian, the main guy, is a horrible boyfriend. And he is, but I don't feel like they're really addressing why. Like, he does not love her, and he does not want to be in this relationship. And this horrible thing happens at the beginning where her family goes through a horrific tragedy, an unimaginable tragedy. And when he was about to break up with her, he now feels like he can't because he needs to be there for her. But she is completely codependent on him, emotionally dependent on him. He's clearly not interested. Neither of them are really fulfilling each other's needs at all. And it is painful to see. But that is where the pagan cult of this movie comes in and possibly fulfilling their needs. Now, pagan cults is a massive part of folklore. We're going to talk about many more on this list. And I do feel like the culture here that we're studying, they mostly exist for shock value. And I think most of the substance of the movie more so comes from the relationship, which is a bit disappointing for me for someone that's very interested in this kind of thing. And also, while some better examples of this kind of movie, like say The Wicker Man, are really interesting for like clashing two different ideologies, our central characters that come into this Swedish colony really don't have an ideology. They're really just either there to study with an open mind or just total blank slates. And that makes it a little bit less interesting, but it is a visually gorgeous movie. It's probably one of the best movies you could possibly watch for the springtime season. Just flowers and greenery, bright sunlight everywhere. I do prefer Ari Aster's previous film, Hereditary, which judging by what it's about, I think I could have put on this list, but I don't know. It just doesn't really feel like folk horror to me, but make no mistake, I love the movie. At number 17, The City of the Dead from 1960. So this film follows a young anthropology student who travels to Whitewood, Massachusetts, which has a long history of witchcraft and witch burnings. She goes in to study that history and finds out possibly those beliefs have not gone away. So yeah, this is a modern day set film. There's actually a lot of folk horror films that are set in modern day, despite the fact that the genre I think is mostly known for period pieces, but this is very much about the old ways, the old religion sticking around under the surface of society. And it's a good old-fashioned devil cult. A lot of cults in folklore, they're more pagan, they're worshiping gods and goddesses and such. This is full on, we're worshiping Satan. I mean, if you like movies where you just go into a dark, foggy, creepy small town where the entire town feels like one big graveyard, this movie really has that. It also has Christopher Lee in it, which is pretty cool. And this is just a very simple folk horror film. It's about an outsider coming into a small town, discovering what's under the surface, a worshiping of the devil. It's textbook and it's very entertaining. At number 16, Apostle from 2018. Taking place in 1905, this film follows a man who travels to a remote island to integrate himself into the strange religious society that lives there in order to find and save his kidnapped sister. So this is another pagan cult movie where they are worshiping some kind of mysterious goddess. But what I really like about this one and what I think differentiates it, it's about what happens when such a cult goes wrong, when things do not go their way and the cult members are not happy and thriving and fully indoctrinated into the mindset such as in Midsommar. But what happens if they are miserable and they want out and they know this thing is absolutely crumbling? The very foundation of this cult structure is just crumbling throughout the entire film. You see, the land that they are living on is described as scorched earth, where nothing should grow, no people should actually be able to settle there. But the leaders of this cult were able to discover a goddess who can make the vegetation thrive. Although not all the time, and that's why things are going very badly. Now, this film was directed by Gareth Evans, who actually directed the Raid movies. It's very strange that the Raid guy, which are martial arts movies, if you don't know, would direct a folk horror film. But that might point to why this is actually very different from a lot of the slower and more atmospheric folk horror films. This film is atmospheric for sure, but it is brutal. It's incredibly bloody and violent, and it's even a bit actiony in some ways. It's not like an action film, but it's got a lot more brutal fighting in it that you might expect for a movie like this. And I really like it for all that. It's very intense, very brutal. I do love the atmosphere of this tiny little colony forming in the early 1900s, but I also just adore the performances here. You got Dan Stevens in the lead role. I'm a huge fan of him. Lucy Boynton, I love her. Michael Sheen, like the performances in this are fantastic and like further add to how just brutal and sweaty and angry and intense this entire movie is. I really like it. At number 15, Burn Witch Burn from 1962. So this film is about a happy married couple in the 1960s. The man is a very successful professor at a college. He has a wonderful wife, but his wife is actually from an island in Jamaica. And there, part of the religious practice is conjure magic. And he finds out that she is actually practicing this witchcraft in order to help him and their family and prop him up at work. And when he makes her throw all of this away, leave all this behind, their lives begin to fall apart. So this is a British horror film that also goes by the title Night of the Eagle. I much prefer the title Burn Witch Burn, but it was based on in a book called The Conjure Wife. And I just love this movie for how it is actually about the positive effects that this magic can have on people's lives and what happens when it is abandoned, when the old ways are left behind, what is left to protect you. And I also like how his wife, who is a witch, like she's practicing magic, she's a witch, is not ugly, she's not evil or anything like that. Like they have this solid relationship and she really is just trying to help him, and he's an idiot for making her throw it away. And there turns out to even be some rival magic against them towards the end. So I think it's a very interesting atmospheric movie. Like when I first saw it, I thought I can just see a direct line between this and like A24 kind of movies like Hereditary and such like that. It feels like such a precursor to movies like that. At number 14, The Vourdalak from 2024. So this film is about a marquis who is lost in the woods. He comes upon a cottage and goes there for help, and they inform him that their father has been gone for several days, and if he comes back after a certain day, they know he is now a Vourdalak. So to my regular viewers, I apologize. You've probably heard me talk about this movie a lot. It just came out this year, and I've really been singing its praises because I'm a huge fan of it. It's based on a French novel that was first published in Russia called The Family of the Vourdalak. And actually, it was first adapted, I believe first, in Mario Bava's Black Sabbath as one segment in this anthology. This is a great folk horror story. I love the atmosphere of this movie so much, just out in the woods, fearing this vampire creature, because that's what a Vourdalak is. It is a form of vampire, but it is a pre-Bram Stoker's Dracula vampire legend. And I think that's why this places as folklore, because it's like this old folk tale about a creature that comes back from the dead and only drinks the blood of its family, of those it loved in life. This movie feels like a lost 1960s made French or Soviet horror movie. Even for the Vourdalak creature, they use this bizarre practical effect that feels so distant from modern movies. I just love how old and just period accurate this movie feels. Speaking of vampires, at number 13, Valerie and Her Week of Wonders from 1970. So this is a Czechoslovakian film about a young girl named Valerie who's going through a very coming-of-age-like story, who puts on a pair of magic earrings, and from then she sees the world in a different light and encounters such things like a vampire and otherworldly carnival folk. I think of all of the movies on this list, I have the least solid argument for why this is folklore, but it's so much because of the feeling and the atmosphere for me. I do think there's just a particular feeling I get from folklore that I really get from this movie. I mean, this film feels like an old vampire folk tale long before Bram Stoker would ever write Dracula, like a fairy tale. I think that's really what it feels like. It is a coming of age movie about this young girl. She is a very likable and sympathetic protagonist, and the vampire in this movie is frightening. He has a very like Nosferatu-like design, which further makes him feel like such an ancient vampire, so different than what Bram Stoker would create with Dracula. But he is intelligent, he speaks, they have these interesting conversations, he has this extremely creepy lair that he brings her back to, and also just the carnival people coming into their small village. It's just so interesting. Like, it's this avant-garde 70s European movie that might not be the kind of thing I'd normally be super into, but I think it's fascinating with this movie. I just love it. At number 12, November from 2017. Taking place in 17th century Estonia, in a poor village, a group of peasants use magic and folk remedies to survive the winter, and a young woman tries to get a young man to love her. Now, of all the movies on this list, this is the one that I've watched the most recently. I actually just watched this last night, and I absolutely fell in love with it. It really feels like an anthology that all takes place in this one village. It feels like a pagan village, although there are references to Jesus and there is a priest and such like that. But as we just follow different parts of the different characters' lives and how they are encountered with all of these struggles and have all of these magical remedies. I mean, there's a witch. I think the most interesting part of it for me is the krot. Now, a krot is a part of ancient Estonian mythology. It's a magical creature that people create themselves by putting together just random household pieces into some kind of humanoid-like shape, and there they can go to the devil and sell their soul in exchange for him to bring the krot to life, to give it a soul. And the legend is people would do this just out of desperation of needing help around their farm in order to survive. And this movie deals with that a lot. It happens like in the very beginning of the film, like where some movies might build up to the supernatural elements. From the very beginning, you're just seeing a krot walk around and talk, and you're just like, well, what is happening? But while I loved the atmosphere, the black and white photography, all of the witchcraft going on, and I also like that we don't have to deal with like witch burnings or accusations or anything like that. All the magical things in this movie are just a normal part of life for these people. What really surprised me about the film is how emotionally invested I got in it and how deeply romantic I found the film to be. There is a storyline about two people in love, both dealing with unrequited love, and it's really emotionally affecting, especially by the end. I won't say whether those are positive or negative emotions. You'll have to watch the movie to find out for yourself, but it was a very affecting movie for me, and I absolutely adored it. At number 11, V from 1967. So this is about a young priest who is ordered to preside over the wake of a young girl in a church of a remote village. And this means spending 3 nights alone with a witch-possessed corpse with only his faith to protect him. So this is another one that I own in this folk horror box set right here. And man, when I first watched this movie, it really felt like I was watching something wholly foreign to me and my culture. This movie felt wildly original. Now, it is based on a novella by the same name, and while I read the novella has some references to some supposed folklore, it seems like most of the ideas in this are original to him. But the movie does deal a lot with witches and witchcraft. There's even this very old, creepy witch towards the beginning that goes for a broom ride that she takes this young priest on, and that is just some of my favorite witch imagery I've ever seen on film. Our young priest is actually a terrible guy. It feels very strange that he's training to be a priest. He feels like an absolute deadbeat, but I guess that's just the kind of character you want to watch go through the insane and horrible situation that it is watching over this young girl, because in that church, he just encounters so many of the craziest looking demons and spirits and creatures I've ever seen on film. I was just blown away by the visual originality and creativity that this movie shows you. So if you just want to watch a movie with just witches and demons and all kinds of insane ancient horror stuff, watch this movie. At number 10, Black Death from 2010. As the Black Plague is ravaging medieval Europe, a young priest is tasked by a group of medieval knights to travel to a remote village that is reportedly immune from this sickness. The knights suspect this is a result of witchcraft and necromancy and are going out there to kill some witches. This is another one I recently saw for the first time, and I loved it. I mean, there should be more medieval set horror movies, because this is a bleak, savage, violent time of history. I mean, this movie is about medieval knights at the time when they were just stamping out all signs of paganism, witchcraft. These are savage witch hunters. And the young priest, played by Eddie Redmayne, is really like the one likable character who's being pulled along for this horrible journey. But the knights are led by Sean Bean, and he is so awesome in this movie. I mean, he feels like a true medieval knight who time traveled to be in this film. Such an interesting and dark and sad but brutal character. And when they get to this village, yes, it turns out it is a pagan village, possibly a pagan cult, led by a witch. I love this witch. She is such a cool, charismatic character. And I mean, you get themes of witchcraft, of necromancy, raising the dead, all kinds of awesome stuff. And the film does feel like savagely accurate in terms of being about Christian knights and the pagans themselves fighting to survival and what happens when they come to blows. It is very violent and brutal and very sad. Like, I think I was looking through the letterbox reviews for this movie after I saw it, and I saw a lot of people do not like this. I think they might not like how sad it is and how it's not really interested in explaining morality to you and kind of explaining, here are your good characters who you as a 2020s modern person can totally relate to in medieval Europe, and here's your bad guys. And the movie's not really interested in playing that game. It's just showing you events and showing what happens when these two kinds of people come to blows. And it's rough, but it is an excellent, excellent movie, I think. At number 9, The Ritual from 2017. And you know, it doesn't feel right to talk about this movie inside the cabin. Grab a jacket, let's get out of here. So The Ritual is a film about a group of friends who go on a multi-day hiking trip through the forests of Sweden as an act of remembrance for a friend who they lost under tragic circumstances. While there, they end up lost and encounter things like witchcraft and an ancient pagan god. So this film was directed by David Bruckner, and it is perfect for folk horror when it comes to its themes about these people who are out in the woods. I mean, I love the woods. I am so happy out here right now, but I also love horror movies that take place in the woods. I mean, getting lost out there is scary enough on its own. But while there, yes, you do get pagan witchcraft. You do get this ancient god. And the creature design, which they hold back for quite a while in this movie, is just incredible. I am amazed by how creative it is. It's not a Wendigo, but it is like the ultimate Wendigo on screen. Absolutely terrifying and so fitting for a god out in the woods. Just the way nature has influenced its design is just incredible to me. The character work here is amazing. Now, our main character is played by an actor named Rafe Spall. You've probably seen him as supporting actor pop up in a lot of things, like Edgar Wright's The Cornetto trilogy, but it's pretty rare that I see him in a lead role, and he's amazing in this. He so perfectly encapsulates a very subtle but devastating feeling of grief, but more importantly, guilt. I think this movie is amazing for how it conveys very male fears and anxieties. Like, I'm sure women can absolutely connect to this movie as well. I can't speak from their perspective, but from mine, like, this is so perfectly about the male fear of being a coward and not being able to protect those you love when your time comes that you are needed. And what if you're just not able to do it and you don't even know if you could have done anything if you tried? But he is carrying all of that with him after a horrific opening scene that is quite a shocker, but so perfectly lines up with the pagan folk horror themes. But I think this movie is scary, atmospheric, and honestly kind of profound. Okay, it's time to get out of the woods. Let's head on back to the cabin. But at number 8, Pumpkinhead from 1988. So this film stars Lance Henriksen as a small store owner and single father whose young son is tragically killed by some city people who come in drinking and carelessly riding their dirt bikes around. And for revenge, he seeks out a mountain-dwelling witch to revive an ancient creature of vengeance. This is one of my favorite horror movies of all time, absolutely one of my favorite creature features. I mean, Lance Henriksen, he's so great in this movie, but the central emotional story is so affecting. I mean, his son is such a sweet little guy, and what happens to him is so horrific. And what makes it even more tragic is the fact that the young city people who come in and are responsible for this, I mean, they're not like monsters. One of them is a really bad guy, but these are like, there's some likable people among them, some good people, and it really is just this incredibly tragic accident that occurs. But that doesn't stop Lance Henriksen from wanting righteous vengeance. And it truly feels like this is the folk horror of mountain people people who live way, way out, the kind of areas of America that none of us will probably ever see. And this mountain witch that he encounters is one of the coolest representations of a witch I've ever seen in a movie. I mean, this is everything you want from a creepy witch living out in a remote cottage. And when she revives the monster, the Pumpkinhead, it's just one of my favorite creatures in any horror movie. The movie is directed by Stan Winston, who did a lot of creature effects for a lot of other movies, and he leaves nothing to be desired. Like, the Pumpkinhead is incredible. The atmosphere where the Pumpkinhead is revived using this folk magic out in the pumpkin patch, it's so awesome. Like, visually speaking, I love this movie, but it is like a really good emotional story. This movie rules. At number 7, Witchfinder General from 1968. Taking place in England in 1645 while a civil war is going on, ravaging through the country, a man named Matthew Hopkins travels from town to town offering his violent and barbaric services as a witch hunter. So this film is known as one of the original folk horror films to really put the genre on the map. I have this film in this Vincent Price collection because it does star Vincent Price as Matthew Hopkins, who was a real guy, actually, which is a very sad thing to learn. And Vincent Price, he gives one of his greatest performances, possibly his greatest performance, as an absolute monster. None of the camp fun of many other Vincent Price movies where he played diabolical characters like in House on Haunted Hill or The Pit and the Pendulum or stuff like that. None of that camp fun can be found here. Here he is a true monster who goes from town to town and slaughters people. Whenever people call him in saying, oh, I don't like this person, I accuse them of being a witch. I mean, he tortures them until they give him some kind of confession or some kind of reason to execute them. And this film is about how the old beliefs that folklore often centers around can affect the real world and how very bad people can take advantage of them. It is a sad and brutal movie while still being like very beautifully atmospheric, and like all the scenes taking place outside, like you hear the sounds of nature, bird calls, and it's a very autumnal movie. I know you guys love when I say the word autumnal. It really does have that kind of fall atmosphere to it. It's like, it's got the visuals of like a cozy little Hammer movie, but it's just so much more disturbing than those movies ever get, which is a weird feeling, but it's an incredible film. At number 6, Pet Sematary from 1989. This film follows a family who moves to an idyllic home out in the countryside and discover their house is actually right next to a pet cemetery. When a zooming truck going by kills their cat, they bury the cat in this pet cemetery and unwittingly reawaken an ancient evil. Of course, based on the Stephen King book of the same name, this is a movie that sometimes I forget to include as folk horror because, I mean, for me, this movie is like the best example of a film for Stephen King-like atmosphere. And sometimes Stephen King seems like his own genre or something like that. And when I want to feel those Stephen King vibes, Pet Sematary from 1989 is probably my favorite movie to go to, but it's definitely a folk horror film as well. The ground is sour. That's something Fred Gwynne's fantastic character keeps saying again and again in this movie, meaning the land that they live on is cursed. And the use of the old folk practices of burying things out in this pet cemetery are haunting the new residents, these small town rituals coming to claim their family. In fact, if you read the book, there's actually references to a Wendigo and how a Wendigo may have cursed this land. They don't really mention that in the movie, but watching the film, you can kind of keep that in your head. Funny enough, if you watch the remake for this movie made in 2019, it's actually got much more folk horror-like visuals in terms of like kids wearing forest animal masks. It looks kind of the Wicker Man like. I just don't think it's near as good a movie because this 1989 version is one of my favorite horror films of all time. It's only a little bit lower on this list because it's not as obvious folk horror visually and in terms of the atmosphere as movies that are going to get placed above it. But like, this is one of the most rewatchable movies ever for me, which is so weird because it's so dark and sad, but somehow director Mary Lambert is able to make it like kind of fun to watch. She injects this bit of camp value to it in terms of like Pascal, this zombie who's like a little bit goofy, and Zelda, who is like one of the scariest things of all time, but she also brings this like fun pulp horror crazy energy to the film as well. At number 5, The Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971. Set in early 18th century England, it follows the residents of a rural village whose youth fall under the influence of a demonic presence after a local farmer unearths a mysterious deformed skull buried in a field. So this is also one of the original movies that really kicked off the idea of folk horror on film. And it was originally going to be an anthology set in a Victorian era village, but the filmmakers decided that that time period had kind of been exhausted by horror, and they centered it all around one story rather than an anthology and moved it to a farming community. And for me, this is some of the best, most typical folk horror imagery you could possibly see. I mean, farmers in 18th century rural England, it's absolutely perfect vibes. And one thing that I really like about this movie, if you compare it to Witchfinder General, I mean, that movie posits that these old superstitions and beliefs are not correct, and it's really just horrible people taking advantage of them to persecute others. But this film posits that the supernatural beliefs of the time were true. The youth going out into the woods are going to worship the devil. The devil's skin does show up on his worshippers. The devil's claw can even show up on them. And the devil is an actual imp-like creature that is living out in the woods. I think the movie is really, really fun. It was actually released with an X rating when it came out, so it is pretty hardcore horror for its time period. And Linda Hayden, as the lead kind of devil-worshipping girl, is fantastic in this movie. At number 4, The Company of Wolves from 1984. A young girl named Rosaline dreams of a village in the dark woods where her granny tells her cautionary tales in which innocent maidens are tempted by wolves. So this film is based on Angela Carter's short story collection, The Bloody Chamber, in which all of the stories are based on old folk tales, or you might say fairy tales, like Little Red Riding Hood. And that's really what this movie is. It's kind of an anthology, although the separation of the stories isn't super clear, but it's a collection of stories all centered around wolves or werewolves, and they all just feel like these very old folk tales in a really cozy way that I absolutely love. Now, this is a good time to mention that while I think you can classify a lot of werewolf movies technically as folk horror, the folk tales of werewolves and such like that, I mostly kept werewolves off this list because I do think it's kind of a separate subgenre, its own subgenre, but this is the one werewolf movie that I am including. And this is one of my favorite werewolf movies of all time. I actually think it's got some of the best werewolf transformation effects that I've ever seen in a movie, and it often doesn't get that kind of credit, which I think is just tragic. But this is another coming-of-age movie about a young girl encountering wolves and getting told stories by Angela Lansbury about wolves and how she must not stray from the path and go deep into the woods, for that is where the wolves reside. Gosh, I just love the feeling of this movie so much. If I just want to watch a movie and feel like I'm being told a collection of old fairy tales, spooky fairy tales, this is gosh, it might be the best movie for that. At number 3, Sleepy Hollow from 1999. So this film follows a police inspector named Ichabod Crane, who is called into a small rural village in New York called Sleepy Hollow to investigate a collection of murders that are happening there, but the residents claim it is all the work of the Headless Horseman. So while this is of course based on The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, which is actually a very early work of fiction to come out of America, the Headless Horseman was actually a common element of folklore in Northern Europe, and it's a very old and classic folktale about a spirit who rides through on a horse searching for his missing head. So honestly, this is a perfect folk horror film in terms of being about a small colonial village, being afraid of a spirit, a local legend, all that kind of stuff. I mean, the Headless Horseman, he's like a perfect campfire tale. But this adaptation itself also adds in witches, a witch out in the woods, which is just, I mean, that's one of my favorite things to possibly be in a folk horror film. But all that being said, I almost felt weird putting this on this list because it's like a fast-paced, super entertaining Hollywood blockbuster horror movie, and that's just very weird for folk horror. We're talking about a lot of slow atmospheric movies on this list, not a lot of movies that feel like Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow, but it is one of my favorite horror films of all time. I love The Headless Horseman. I love Johnny Depp as Ichabod Crane. I love the original story and the Disney version as well, and this is very different, but I think the changes that they made for this adaptation were very good ideas, very smart changes to turn this into a big Hollywood movie. At number 2, The Witch from 2015. So taking place in early 1600s New England, this film is actually about a farmer who's so intense in his Puritan faith, he is actually kicked out of the village where him and his family lived, and he relocates them out to a very remote plot of land at the edge of the forest, but encounter a witch of the woods that's going to tear them apart. It's written and directed by Robert Eggers, who's one of my favorite filmmakers working today. And one thing I love about him is he's honestly less obsessed with movies and more obsessed with ancient folklore, fairy tales, stories of ghosts, of witches, of long past, and just interested in the past in general. And he's like this obsessive researcher before he makes his movies. And for this film, I mean, so much of it is actually based on stories and accounts that happened in New England during this time period. Even a lot of lines of dialogue in the movie are based on written accounts that he could find. I just love how extremely period accurate this movie is. While he wanted to film it in New England, it ended up being filmed in Canada because of tax incentives, but his difficulty in finding the right filming location made them go somewhere extremely remote, and you can feel that in the movie. This truly feels like the middle of nowhere. And when I first saw this movie in theaters in 2015, it absolutely terrified me. I think this is one of the scariest movies of the past many years. And you don't just get a witch, you get Black Phillip, the devil, taking the form of a black goat. I mean, how awesome is that? At number 1, The Wicker Man from 1973. So this film follows a police sergeant who travels to a remote Scottish island to try to locate a young girl who has been reported missing. There, he encounters that the entire island is populated by a pagan cult, and he may be there for their sinister purpose. So this film is directed by Robin Hardy, and the filmmakers behind it have stated their goal with the movie was to make a film about the old religion, which wasn't very common in this time, but they didn't want to make just like a satanic cult movie like had been done many times, but a film truly about paganism. And Robin Hardy did extensive research on old pre-Christian religious practices. The film is technically an adaptation of a book called Ritual, but it is very loosely based. What I love about this film is it is so excellent in being about the clash of two different ideologies. I talked about Midsommar, how I feel like the cult is missing a counterpoint in that movie, but Sergeant Howie is this extremely devout Christian, very intolerant of other religions. So he is very opposed to these pagans as soon as he shows up there. But the cult is all led by Lord Summerisle, who is played by Christopher Lee. And Christopher Lee is incredible in this movie. This is, I think, his favorite movie that he ever made. And what's great about him is he is so full of life and full of joy. And he is so excited about this world that he has created there. And the people who live on this island are so happily a part of this cult. So you almost feel like Sergeant Howie, our main character, is like this wet blanket coming in just kind of yelling at them for enjoying their life. But of course, when we get to the very famous ending of this movie, the peace and love of the cult does turn quite a bit. Now, the image of the Wicker Man was actually taken from a description of a practice by the Gauls that was written about by Julius Caesar. So I think it's just so cool that they did just that level of research. It's also a musical, and I love every song. For me, The Wicker Man is easily the greatest film of this genre. That is my list, but I want to know yours. Let me know down in the comments below what are some of your favorite folk horror films. And if you want some more ranking videos on spooky topics, check out this playlist right down here. You can also check out this video for more fun as well. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. I would definitely appreciate that. Thank you so much. Don't forget to enjoy yourself this Halloween season, and I will see you next time.